Have you ever heard about that guy who threw away a laptop which had the key to a Bitcoin wallet on it? Some British dude called James Howells threw an old laptop into the trash, then didn't realize the key was on its hard drive till it was all the way down at the city dump. When he accidentally tossed it out, the Bitcoin was worth around $8 million, and by 2017, it was worth $100 million. And now in 2025, it's worth almost $250 million. And that's right, billion with a B. And that guy's offered a huge reward, paid for his own private forensics team. He's even tried suing the city council members that he thinks stole it. But it doesn't look like he's ever going to find that laptop, which basically means the dude's got to live with the fact that he tossed almost $1 billion into the trash. It's a cruel world, right? And it doesn't get much crueler than that. But when I first read about it, all I remember thinking was, holy crap, dude, I could get rich from that crypto stuff. And this was back around spring of 2021 when I first started looking into cryptocurrencies and reading about the markets. I met some really cool people, and then in May of 2021, one of my crypto buddies hit me up with a tip that he thought I might find helpful. A few months prior, before we started talking, he'd spotted a cryptocurrency named Luna that had jumped from 50 cents per token to $6 per token. Such a large spike was obviously of interest to him, so he started reading up on Luna to see what the deal was. And what he read amazed him. It turned out that Luna was just a reserve asset for something called Terra USD, an algorithmic stablecoin designed to retain a 1-to-1 peg with the US dollar. I guess a lot of people will appreciate me translating that into English, so here you go. Terra USD was backed by a ton of investors who all poured millions of dollars into the company who created it. And that's kind of why it was called a stablecoin. With all that money behind it, it couldn't fail, so it remained stable in price. Luna, on the other hand, was an asset that could fluctuate in price per token, but since it was tied to Terra USD, it could never fluctuate too severely and was almost guaranteed to rise in value over time. My buddy told me that he'd waited for a slight dip to buy in, and he did so at $5 per token. But just over a month later, that same $5 token was worth over 4 times as much at $20.71. The currency had then remained somewhat stable for a while before suffering a minor crash, dropping down to around $5 again in May. And that is when my buddy texted me saying it was the perfect time to buy in. He told me he was 99% sure that despite the brief wobble, Luna was about to bounce back in a big way. There was already talk of interest returning, no doubt because of its ties to Terra USD, and my buddy was so confident he bought a bunch more tokens before he decided to text me. That was the thing that really swayed me, and I remember joking with him saying, well, if we go down together. And then since I had a grand total of $490 saved, I bought 100 Luna tokens at $4.81 apiece. When I told her, the girl that I was seeing at the time thought I was nuts, and so did an offline friend of mine named Chris. And when I say offline friend, I mean Chris was both a friend in real life that I knew from high school and someone who didn't pay much attention to stuff online. He had an Instagram account and had played a little Madden with random douchebags from time to time. But apart from that, he was just a regular dude more comfortable with the insides of a car than a computer. He thought I was out of my mind for spending almost $500 on invisible coins, but he wasn't saying that come August time when Luna's value rose from 10 to 20, then $30 per token. And I remember showing him my wallet and he said, "So, can you just cash out whenever you want?" And I explained that no, I had to find a buyer first, but that was easy when a token's value was on the up and up. Then, since the app I was using did that for me, there was a chance that I could make $2,900 profit within less than an hour. And that's when he went from thinking it was all just a scam to realizing there really was something that this whole crypto thing had going on. He sat on my couch, asked me a bunch of questions about it, and I answered everything as best I could given my own limited experience. I was honest too. The same kind of honest people had been with me and told him it was all effectively just gambling. but that in Luna, myself and a whole bunch of other people had found something with potential for long-term stability. It was still a gamble, but it was just about the safest bet out there for the time being. And for the remainder of 2021, Chris would always ask about my crypto wallet every time we hung out, and it was always good news. Every time he was over, he'd see how much Luna had risen in value, and he'd always make some offhand comment about giving me a bunch of money so I could turn him a quick profit. I didn't think that was such a hot idea, and had always given him the advice that I got. Watch the markets for a while, get to know the system, and then be headstrong and patient enough to make the right buys at the right time. To really profit, you had to wait for a crash, and by the holidays of 2021, when Luna had risen from $30 to $60 to $93 and change, it didn't look like one was coming anytime soon. I told him I'd hit him up the moment one happened. After a very brief drop, which I didn't quite think was the right time, Luna dipped all the way down to around $45 a token at the end of January 2022. I gave him a call and told him it was the perfect time to buy himself in. And then, after talking him through the process of obtaining a crypto wallet, I asked him how many coins he wanted to buy. I don't really know what I was expecting to hear. Maybe a figure similar to my own. A nice round number like 100 or 50 given how much more expensive it was by then. And so when Chris told me he wanted not 100, but 300 tokens, I was a little taken aback. I thought I was being kind of wild fronting $4,000. Then there was Chris making an investment of almost $14,000, and he was not a rich guy. When I asked if he was sure, he seemed confident as can be, and I guess he based that confidence on what I told him. Every time Luna took a dip, it came back stronger than ever. So just over a month later, when it had risen from less than 50 to over $100 a token, we both figured he'd made the right choice. Chris's investment was now worth almost $30,000. He'd doubled his money, and as you can imagine, he was very, very happy with me. By the start of April 2022, Luna was almost $120 per token, and my buddy Chris was not only singing my praises every chance he got, but seemed convinced that we were going to be millionaires by the end of the year. I remember one time we were drinking in a bar after a Red Sox game, and he started getting kind of emotional, saying something like, "Dude, I really appreciate what you done for me. This could change my whole life." I told him I doubted that we'd be that rich come the end of the year, and that I was planning on selling my tokens as soon as they hit $150. I'd make an insane profit that way, and if Chris did the same thing, he'd more than triple his money. And then, with a little patience, we could wait for another stable coin to be minted, which wouldn't be long in light of Luna's success, and then start the process all over again. That was my theory anyway, but Chris took it as gospel. I said what I said to try and bring him back down to earth, and maybe it was the Bud Light talking, but he says, "Told you, dude, it might not be this year, but we're gonna get rich off the back of this thing, and I got you to thank for it." In the moment, I felt really proud of myself, honestly. It was probably going to make a ton of money off the back of my Luna purchase, but I'd also helped a friend out too. Not in a life-changing way by any means, but over time, if we played our cards right, the passive income would probably prove to be life-changing. And that was the start of April. And by the end of the year, if the market trends persisted, Luna was estimated to rise to somewhere around $200 a token. But as the saying goes, man proposes and God disposes. Just a few days after our drunken heart-to-heart in that sports bar, when I'd felt on top of the world for helping make Chris a little money, Luna took a sharp dip. And then over the next 2 weeks or so, it went from around $120 per token to about $75 per token. Chris called me for reassurance, and I told him what I always did. Every dip was followed by a new peak. It had been that way since Luna was created, and all we had to do was wait a few days for the value to creep back up. It didn't even take 24 hours. The next day, Luna had shot up from the floor price of $75 per token to about a nicer $90 per token. and then after a little more fluctuation, it stabilized at around $95, with every expectation of increasing further in value through May of 2022. Now May starts, and just as predicted, Luna's prices rose again. And then somehow I ended up coming down with this really terrible case of something and was basically bedbound for a couple of days with the exception of trips to the bathroom to puke or poop. And I remember checking my portfolio at one point and seeing Luna had dipped to just under $70 per token. But I wasn't worried, and I had every faith that it'd do its usual thing of skyrocketing to a new high after a period of fluctuation. A lot of stuff after that is kind of hazy, and I remember passing out for at least 13 hours or so once the worst of the sickness was out of me. But then, when I woke up at around 3:30 a.m. on May 11th, 2022, a date that'll forever be burned into my brain, I realized my entire world had been turned completely upside down. After tracking Luna's value, I realized that maybe only an hour after I passed out around 13 hours before, it had dropped from just below $70 to $33 per token. A couple of hours later, it sank to $16 per token, and then I literally watched it in real time as it dropped to 15, then 14, then unlucky 13, right before my very eyes. I never thought that I was the fainting type. I had been in a bad accident as a teenager and seen the meat on the inside of my leg when the broken bone tore its way through the skin. I didn't feel lightheaded. I didn't pass out. I just thought, uh-oh, I need an adult. But when I looked at my phone that morning, I saw Luna's value falling and falling and falling, and I had to sit back down on my bed to keep from falling down actually. My head was spinning, my chest felt tight, and I had to keep taking super deep breaths to keep myself from, I don't know, either puking or passing out or descending into some kind of manic freakout. I started checking forums, message boards, and group chats I was in for any clue as to what had happened. I hoped to God I'd read something reassuring, something about Luna being set to bounce back after suffering a glitch or miscalculation in the blockchain or whatever. But I saw the opposite. Luna had crashed and it wasn't coming back. But how the hell had such a stable asset suddenly crashed and burned like that? Okay, so remember how I told you about Luna being tied to that Terra USD, and how that was tied to the US dollar to keep everything nice and stable? Well, that turned out to be a lie. The dudes who created it told everyone it was supposed to maintain a 1-to-1 peg with the US dollar, but that was nothing but a ruse to lure investors into what was ultimately a kind of unconventional Ponzi scheme. In other words, it was a scam. A very well-disguised one that fooled a lot of people, and I fell for it too. But then in doing so, I hadn't just lost $400 of my own money. Chris had lost tens of thousands of dollars, and he was pissed. When I woke up from my super sleep, one of the things that had me suspecting something was wrong was the fact that I had like 50 missed calls from Chris, along with almost 24 text messages too. I guess he got an alert that Luna was crashing, and then went into full-blown panic mode while I was passed out. His text progressed from stuff like, "Bro, are you seeing this?" and "Dude, this cannot be happening right now," to stuff like, "Pick up the effing phone, bro," and "Are you ducking me right now? Pick up the phone." I remember tapping the little call symbol, very frantic, and then getting nothing but rings until I hit voicemail. I told Chris to call me back as soon as he was awake because even though his last call had come almost 40 minutes prior, I figured that he had to sleep since 4 a.m. was fast approaching at that point. But part of me doubted that he was asleep, mainly because there was no way that I'd be sleeping if I was in his position. And I was right, because maybe only 15 to 20 minutes later, someone started buzzing my apartment from downstairs. I have one of those little intercoms, the kind with a little screen so you can see and talk to the person buzzing you, and I had a pretty good idea of who it was before I saw. It was Chris, but he didn't look angry. He just looked almost deflated. I pressed the intercom button and told him to come on up, and then I walked back into my kitchen to turn on my coffee machine and let it warm up, because I figured that we had a long and painful heart-to-heart ahead of us. I grabbed 2 cups from the cabinet and then heard Chris's footsteps in the hallway outside. I started walking to the door and then said something to him like, "Hey man, I'll open up." And he responded by slamming what sounded like a fist into the door before growling, "Open the F up." He sounded completely sauced, like drunk as a goddamn skunk, so instead of just opening the door, I took a look through the peephole and then saw Chris literally swaying back and forth on the other side of the door. It wasn't like a dramatic swaying, it was very subtle, but that's how drunk he'd gotten himself, so drunk he could barely stand. I remember how my hands reached for the latch and door handle before suddenly I paused. I had this flash of an ultra-drunk Chris smashing up my apartment like a bowl in a china shop after some boozed-up argument descended into violence. I thought maybe I was just overthinking it, but no sooner had that thought popped into my head, Chris slammed his fist into the door again with a loud yell saying, "Open the effing door, we need to talk." And that feeling came back fast, the one that made me think letting him inside wasn't such a good idea. And so I suggested he go back home and just sleep it off so we can talk about it over the phone come the morning. I even suggested I'd order him an Uber on my dime by way of an apology for not picking up his calls. And then I was halfway into explaining how sick I'd been when something slammed into the door so hard it made me jump back. I figured he was trying to kick my door in because I heard bam, then bam, and then bam, one each harder than the last. I started yelling at Chris to stop, and he gave the door a few more kicks before he stopped. But then he launched into some sloppy drunk rant about how he was going to kill me when he'd finished kicking my door down. I tried explaining what happened with Luna, as in why it had crashed and all of that, but it was no good. He was yelling too loud to hear me, and even if he wasn't, I don't think he was lucid enough to even understand. He kept saying, "Open the door, James, open the door," in a way that honestly sounded like he was losing his mind, and that alone scared the crap out of me. But I also was faced with the very real possibility of having to violently defend myself against one of my best friends, and that's a feeling that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. The kind that makes tears well up in my eyes just thinking about it now, even all these years later. And in the moment, I knew I should call the cops, but I couldn't. I couldn't do that to him. Part of me figured that I could just talk him down, but the other part knew I couldn't. I remember thinking that maybe just seeing me holding a knife might shock some sense into him, but I couldn't bring myself to go get one either. I just kept saying, "Please, man, don't do this. This isn't you." But Chris didn't stop. Not until I heard someone else out in the corridor yelling at him to stop. I recognized that voice of my neighbor from down the hallway, but I also recognized the fear and surprise in Chris's voice when I heard him angrily say back, Okay, I'll stop." I knew my neighbor must have been pointing a gun at him or something because when I looked through the peephole, Chris literally had his hands in the air as he backed away from the door, and then I heard my neighbor yell at him to get out of there before he gets himself shot. Chris kind of came to his senses, I suppose, in that moment, and I thank God that he didn't bring his own gun, and I know he owns one, so we all quite literally dodged a bullet with that one. And then maybe 10 or 20 seconds after my neighbor came to the rescue, Chris staggered out of my apartment building and presumably went to his car. I thanked my neighbor a whole bunch, and he'd already called the cops, so one arrived not long after to ask what had happened. And while I told him everything, start to finish, I also said that I didn't want to press charges against Chris because he wasn't in his right mind. I remember telling the cop about all the crypto he lost, and when I told him the amount, he said, "How much did you guys lose?" He couldn't believe it. He didn't even know what crypto was, really. Before he left, he advised me to keep my distance from Chris for a couple of days. A phone call might be an idea, as he might be happy to hear that I wasn't pressing charges, but I wasn't to do something stupid like show up on his doorstep, otherwise it might be me getting a gun pointed in my face. Now, I tried calling, but he didn't answer. I tried texting, but he didn't reply. I tried contacting Chris on Instagram, and he blocked me, and then I tried asking his girlfriend and mutual friends to pass on messages, but none came back. I figured he'd stay mad for a few days, maybe a week or two tops, because sooner or later, he had to figure out that it wasn't my fault. But as much as it breaks my heart to say it, that didn't happen. And the way Chris saw it, I was either dumb enough to have lost him his money, or I was in on the scam and I'd stolen it somehow, and either way, he was done with me. I didn't know it at the time, but that night when he screamed at me from behind a locked door, that was the last time we'd ever talk. And there marked the end of my crypto journey. I didn't throw away a laptop with almost $1 billion, but I threw away a friendship, and those are worth more than money could ever buy. Born on September 20th of 1961 in Baltimore, Maryland, Sharon Rena Lopatka was the first of 4 daughters born to Mr. and Mrs. Abraham J. Denberg. As a young lady, she was a cantor at the Beth Tefillah Synagogue in nearby Pikesville and was a part of her high school sports teams and choir club. Peers described her as being as normal as you can get, and then sometime following her graduation in 1979, she began dating a construction worker named Victor Lopatka. Sharon's Orthodox parents didn't entirely approve of the relationship, but that didn't deter her in the slightest. She moved into his Hampstead tract house in 1990, and they married the following year. In 1995, Sharon and Victor were living in Ellicott City, and to bring in a little extra cash each month, Sharon began an online advertising business based out of their home. Her first venture, House of Dion, sold mail-order home decor guides for $7 apiece. An advertisement on the website read, "Home decorating secrets seen in the posh homes from the New England states to the Hollywood homes can now be yours. Never published before. Quick, easy ways to decorate your home." Sharon proved such an effective advertiser that she was able to begin selling her copywriting skills for $50 per copy, and did so under the trading name Classified Concepts. Victor, who was initially skeptical of a nascent internet's money-making potential, was as proud as he was surprised by his wife's success. He encouraged her to continue her enterprising ways, which resulted in Sharon spending more and more time on the internet. In addition to her copywriting and home decor guide businesses, Sharon began managing the sales department for several websites offering psychic readings to its users. She also negotiated herself a percentage of sales from other services, some with premium rate telephone numbers by advertising them on her websites. Within just a few short months, Sharon had transformed their home computer into a home enterprise, and it's clear she recognized the internet's near limitless capacity for commerce. Yet unfortunately, in her quest to provide for her family, Sharon began venturing into the seedy underbelly of the Let's Read YouTube channel. Yet unfortunately, in her quest to provide for her family, Sharon began venturing into the seedy underbelly of the World Wide Web. Even in the internet's earliest years, the adult entertainment industry fielded a strong presence, having recognized the potential for widespread distribution and subscription-based payment systems. Sharon was no different, and immediately saw what a huge demand there was for online adult entertainment. With her strengths lying in marketing, Sharon offered her services to a number of distributors, and once again found a huge demand for her lucrative skill set. Yet it wasn't long before Sharon observed another pattern of online behavior. The more extreme the adult entertainment, the more money there was to be made. Sharon noticed that those interested in the more extreme varieties, which depicted subjects being restrained, hypnotized, or chloroformed, would pay double, or sometimes triple what consumers of milder varieties were willing to hand over. And to her, it was a no-brainer. She could receive up to 3 times her regular rate of pay for the same amount of work, and so, under the pseudonym of Nancy Carlson, she once again raised her salary ceiling, much to the delight of her husband. As Sharon began tailoring her online expertise to the more perverse and depraved, she began selling her undergarments, and it's here that her interests appeared to shift from professional to personal. she transformed the mere pseudonym of Nancy Carlson into a full-blown online persona, and while visiting obscene chat rooms would pretend to be a 300-pound dominatrix who starred in several adult films. It's believed Sharon would offer a certain kind of online chat session in exchange for cash, which once again contributed to her ever-rising revenue. But somewhere along the way, her behavior took a dark turn. She began posting advertisements which claimed her ultimate fantasy was to be kidnapped, tortured, and killed by a masked stranger, and did so with such authenticity that it generated a huge amount of activity. Some offered to fulfill her fantasies, while others, such as a user named Tanith, felt Sharon was going too far. Tanith, who claimed to be some kind of online activist, appeared concerned for Sharon's mental health and gently warned her of the potential consequences. But Sharon did not explain that her posts were eccentric entrepreneurialism, nor did she claim that they were just unrealistic fantasies. Instead, she replied, "I want the real thing. I did not ask for you to preach to me." It was a Sunday morning on October 13th of 1996 when Sharon told her husband she was driving over to Georgia to meet some old friends. Her husband wished her a safe trip, then went about his day as normal, but Sharon was not headed to Georgia. Instead, she drove for 45 minutes towards Baltimore's Pennsylvania station, then arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina at around 8:45 p.m. Around the same time she arrived in Charlotte, Sharon's husband noticed a handwritten note she'd left lying on the kitchen table. It's not clear exactly what was written, but not only did Sharon request that her husband refrain from searching for her, but she wrote, "If my body is never retrieved, don't worry. Know that I'm at peace." Victor rushed to inform police that his wife was missing and potentially in danger, but it was already too late. Sharon had already met with the man she'd made an unholy arrangement with, Robert Glass. For nearly 16 years, Robert Frederick Glass lived an unremarkable life as a computer analyst working for the government of Catawba County. He wed a woman named Sherry, with whom he'd shared 3 children, and their marriage lasted 14 happy years until May of 1996, when Sherry logged onto her husband's computer. There in Robert's email account, Sherry found several emails she later described as raw, violent, and disturbing. Under the usernames Toyman and Slowhand, Robert had secretly been visiting illicit chat rooms for years. But he wasn't simply swapping pillow talk with like-minded strangers. He seemed to delight in the prospect of inflicting suffering on the innocent, and he did so in a way that suggested it was far more than just a mere fantasy. Sherry promptly filed for divorce, and given the nature of his indiscretion, Robert Glass lost access to his children. This proved understandably devastating for Robert, but instead of pulling himself away from such perversions and living a cleaner existence, he poured himself into his depravities as a coping mechanism. Over the months that followed, Robert sank deeper and deeper into debauchery and grew steadily more fixated on the thrill of inflicting suffering and taking lives. Then eventually, in August of 1996, Robert Glass found one of Sharon's posts, and the two began an unhealthy and obsessive online affair. They exchanged 900 pages worth of emails in just over a month, before eventually coming to a nightmarish agreement. They would meet up, then after a few final days of depravity, Robert would end Sharon's life. During the missing persons investigation that followed her husband's report, detectives gained access to Sharon's computer, and it's here they discovered the exact nature of her communications with Robert Glass. Maryland detectives swiftly contacted their North Carolina counterparts, who arranged for Glass's home to be put under surveillance. Officers then spent 24 hours staking out his house, but there were no sightings of Sharon Lopatka. And then finally, on October 25th, a judge issued a search warrant for the home and police swooped in. Inside the house, officers discovered several of Sharon's belongings in addition to bondage equipment and drug paraphernalia. They also uncovered a .357 Magnum handgun along with several computer disks which appeared to contain child exploitation material. But it wasn't until officers searched the home's backyard that they made the most chilling discovery of them all. Buried under a mound of soil around 75 feet from the house, officers unearthed body parts belonging to Sharon Lopatka. Glass was at work when he was arrested, and then after being charged with first-degree murder, he was held without bond at the Caldwell County Jail. He pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and exploitation charges on January 27th of the year 2000, and was sentenced to between 3 and 6 years in the Avery Mitchell Correctional Institution. Glass was also sentenced to an additional 27 months on federal charges of second-degree minor exploitation to be served consecutively. In an interview conducted during his imprisonment, Glass admitted to fulfilling Sharon's torture fantasy, but was quick to add that her death was an accident. "I don't know how much I pulled the rope," he said, "but I never wanted to kill her." John Butts, the chief state medical examiner of North Carolina, agreed with Glass's claim that the strangling was accidental. Police did not. They described the death as intentional, and unfortunately for Glass, they had 900 pages of written evidence to support their claim that Sharon's murder was both intentional and premeditated. The Lopatka case was reportedly the first in which a murder suspect was put in custody by a police department based purely on email evidence. Then, in its aftermath, most of the media coverage emphasized the dangerous consequences of meeting strangers from the internet. Several people requested that a type of censorship be created to better protect humans from killings like that of Lopatka's. Scott Bradner, a consultant with Harvard University's Office of Information Technology, vehemently disagreed. "Blaming the medium for the difficulty of some people who exist in society is wrong," he said. "It's the Luddites of the world who claim new technology is inherently evil." Sharon's case might be symbolic of the risks associated with spending too much time online, but her malady is not a new one. One evening in September of the year 1791, a Czech composer living in London named František Kocouara decided to visit a lady of the night. A few hours later, once the pair had eaten dinner, Kocouara paid Susanna Hill 2 shillings before requesting she castrate him. Hill refused, but agreed to strangle Kocouara during intimacy. But then, by the time they were finished, he was dead. One of the first recorded cases of what we might call carnal asphyxiation, Susanna Hill was charged with František Kocouara's murder. But following her trial at the Old Bailey on September 16th, the jury accepted her testimony and she was acquitted on all charges. Robert Glass, on the other hand, received no such mercy. He was incarcerated at the Avery Mitchell Correctional Institution in North Carolina, then spent the next 2 years as an exemplary prisoner who appeared racked with regret. The guilt seemed to have weighed heavily on Glass's heart, too, because on February 20th of 2002, just 2 weeks before he was set to be released, he suffered a massive myocardial infarction. Glass was rushed to the Spruce Pine Community Hospital, but was later pronounced dead at exactly 1:30 a.m. the following morning. His death marked the end of a terrifying chapter in the history of digital criminality and illustrates what can happen when dark, violent fantasies collide with the harsh light of reality. In the pre-dawn hours of a cool September morning back in 1998, the sleepy English town of Charbury in Oxfordshire was stirred by the low hum of police vans as they converged on a small 2-story home on Crowborough Villas. The detached house, a faded Victorian property with peeling paint and a small front yard, was their target's last known address. Intelligence suggested he lived alone and was deeply paranoid, often keeping erratic hours and using multiple exits and entrances on the off chance he was being tailed. A dog unit stood ready in case he attempted to flee via the back garden, through which he had access to the dense woodlands which surrounded the town. Acting on a tip from the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation, the dawn raid was timed for 5 a.m. sharp, an hour when only the farmers working surrounding fields would have stirred from their slumber. Oxfordshire police had managed to piece together a vast web of clues and evidence, including private emails and computer metadata. All had pointed back to the terraced house on Crowborough Villas, while suggesting its resident was part of a colossal global network of child-abusing cybercriminals. At 4:55 a.m., a team of 12 tactically clad officers from Oxfordshire Police assembled outside the house. One stepped forward, his fist hammering on the door before he yelled, "Police, open the door now." While no response came, a battering ram splintered the front door's lock, and the officers flooded inside. The ground floor was a mess of stacked newspapers and unwashed dishes, with the smell of old cigarettes hanging in the air. Torch beams swept the darkened rooms as officers moved methodically, clearing the living room and kitchen. Upstairs, they found 28-year-old Ian Baldock in a back bedroom, startled awake and scrambling to pull on a jacket. "Hands up, don't move," an officer barked. Baldock froze, his face pale in the flashlight's glare. He knew the game was up, and that escape was impossible. By 6:30 a.m., as first light crept over the village, Baldock was being loaded into a police van. Drawn by the commotion, neighbors peered from windows, whispering about the man they'd known as a quiet, shifty figure who was rarely seen in local pubs such as Ye Old Three Horseshoes. The raid disrupted the morning calm, with police tape fluttering across the property and officers standing ground as forensic teams arrived to carry away Baldock's computer. The seizure and arrest resulted from months of solid work, with Baldock being the first domino in a chain that would eventually take down one of the world's largest child exploitation networks. This is the story of Operation Cathedral. Launched in 1998, the advent of Operation Cathedral stands as a pivotal moment in the fight against child exploitation on the internet. It specifically targeted the Wonderland Club, a secretive international child exploitation ring that operated entirely online. The club's name, taken from the Lewis Carroll story Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, masked a horrifying reality. They constituted a network of individuals who produced, shared, and traded in child exploitation material on an unprecedented scale. The operation, which involved law enforcement agencies from multiple countries, not only dismantled the club, but also exposed the complexities of combating cybercrime at a time when the internet was still relatively new. The investigation that led to Operation Cathedral began in the United States in 1996, when the FBI uncovered evidence of a large-scale child exploitation material network during an unrelated investigation into domestic cybercrime. This initial discovery became part of a broader FBI operation known as Innocent Images, which aimed to combat the growing problem of child exploitation on the internet. As the operation progressed, the FBI uncovered a group of individuals who were using the internet to share material. Yet after just a short period of surveillance, it became clear that they were part of a much larger international network, the Wonderland Club. The Wonderland Club was not some loosely affiliated group of perverts, but rather a rigorously structured hierarchy that enforced strict membership rules. In order to join, prospective members not only had to provide the organization with at least 10,000 images of child exploitation, but they had to ensure these images had not already been circulated within the group. This requirement made sure that the club's library of exploitation material grew continuously and exponentially, making it one of the largest repositories of such material in human history. The club operated online using encrypted communication channels, which made it difficult for law enforcement to track the identities of its members. They also instituted a strict hierarchical structure, including ranks based on the quantity and quality of the material contributed, with higher-ranking members having access to more exclusive content. It was later revealed that the club had members in at least 14 countries, so given the international scope of the network, the FBI reached out to law enforcement agencies in those countries to coordinate a global response. The UK's National Crime Agency took the lead, working closely with the FBI and other international partners to gather intelligence and plan a coordinated takedown of the network. This collaboration was essential, as the Internet's borderless nature meant that no single country could tackle the problem alone. One of the most significant challenges detectives faced in investigating the Wonderland Club was the group's use of encryption and other methods to conceal their activities. Members communicated almost entirely through what are known as anonymous remailers, which strip identifying information from emails and use encryption to protect the content of messages and files. Additionally, the club's decentralized structure meant that there was no single server or hub that could be easily targeted. Instead, members shared material directly with one another through peer-to-peer networks. To overcome such obstacles, law enforcement employed a combination of traditional investigative techniques along with cutting-edge cyber forensics. Undercover officers began infiltrating the club by posing as potential members. Then, once they gained access to the group's communications, they were able to begin gathering evidence on individual crimes. But this was a delicate and dangerous process, as any potential misstep could alert the club's members to the investigation and cause them to scatter into the darkest depths of the internet. Another challenge was the sheer volume of material officers had to sift through. The Wonderland Club's library was estimated to contain over 250,000 images and almost 1,800 videos of child abuse stored on computers, disks, and other media. Analyzing this material in order to identify victims and perpetrators required significant resources and expertise. It also forced agencies to develop new tools and techniques to handle the scale of forensic data, including cutting-edge software programs that categorized and matched images to known victims. Yet while it would undoubtedly be a force for good, the investigation also raised important legal and ethical questions. For example, in order to gather evidence, undercover officers had to engage with the club's members, and in some instances, view or even share exploitation material. This raised concerns about the potential for law enforcement to inadvertently contribute to the exploitation of children, even if it was in the pursuit of justice. To address this, strict protocols were put in place to ensure that any actions taken by undercover officers were carefully controlled, and that the focus remained on identifying and rescuing victims. Yet the issue is still reminiscent of a Friedrich Nietzsche quote from his work Beyond Good and Evil. "He who fights with monsters might take care lest he thereby become a monster. And if you gaze for long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you." After 2 years of solid investigation, Operation Cathedral culminated in a series of coordinated raids which took place on September 2nd of 1998. Law enforcement agencies in 13 countries, including the UK, the US, Australia, Germany, and Italy, executed simultaneous search warrants, then swiftly arrested suspects to prevent the club's members from warning one another. In total, over 100 individuals were arrested, and a vast amount of evidence was seized, including computers, hard drives, and other digital storage devices. One of the most high-profile arrests was that of Gary Salt, a British man who was found to be a key member of the club. Salt's home contained a large collection of exploitation material, and he was later sentenced to 12 years in prison for his despicable contributions. While over in the United States, the FBI arrested a man from California who was found to have over 100,000 images on his computer. Thankfully, the raids led to the identification of several child victims, including a 10-year-old American girl who was rescued after images of her abuse were found in the possession of a club member. This underscored the real-world impact of the operation, as it not only dismantled the network, but also saved children from ongoing exploitation. Despite the operation being a complete success, the legal outcomes of Operation Cathedral varied wildly depending on the jurisdiction. For example, in the UK, several members of the Wonderland Club were convicted and received significant prison sentences. But while the likes of Gary Salt were sentenced to 12 years, another member, David Hines, received a sentence of just 30 months in prison. In the United States, sentences were much more severe, with some individuals receiving up to 20 years in prison for even the most minor of involvements. But not all arrests led to convictions, and in some cases, insufficient evidence or legal technicalities resulted in charges being dropped. There is, however, a silver lining to that dark, dark cloud, in that it exposes gaps in legal frameworks, especially in countries where laws against child exploitation are either outdated or insufficient to address the scale and nature of the crimes. Naturally, this has led to calls for stronger legislation and better international cooperation to combat online child exploitation, and brick by brick, gaps in the defenses are being filled. Operation Cathedral also had a profound impact on law enforcement practices. It served as a model for future efforts, such as Operation Avalanche in 2001 and Operation Ore in 2002, both of which targeted similar networks. In response to the operation, several countries introduced new initiatives aimed at improving online safety, including public awareness campaigns and the development of software to block access to harmful content. The operation also raised public awareness about the dangers of the internet, particularly for children, and highlighted the need for education and resources to protect them from online predators. By dismantling the Wonderland Club, law enforcement agencies not only brought perpetrators to justice, but also rescued victims and prevented further harm. The operation's legacy lives on in the continued efforts to combat child exploitation online, serving as a reminder of both the progress that has been made and the challenges that lie ahead. As the internet continues to evolve, so too must the strategies used to protect the most vulnerable. But with determination, cooperation, and innovation, even the most secretive and sophisticated criminal networks can be brought to justice. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to always work your front glutes.